The evening air hummed with the soft strains of a classical quartet, their delicate notes weaving through the glittering chandeliers and polished marble of the grand ballroom. The scent of fresh lilies mingled with the faint aroma of champagne as distinguished guests moved about, their laughter blending with the occasional clink of crystal glasses. Seo Ji-hyun stood near the edge of the room, his tall, commanding figure cutting a striking silhouette against the backdrop of golden light. His tailored navy suit fit him impeccably, the sharp lines accentuating his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark eyes, often unreadable, flickered with a glimmer of unease as he scanned the crowd. Tonight wasn't just about networking or upholding his company's pristine image. It was about confronting something that had lingered like an unhealed wound. Across the room, his gaze froze. Han Yoon-ji. She stood at the center of a small circle of admirers, her figure poised yet effortlessly graceful. Her black dress, modest but exquisitely detailed, reflected her newfound confidence, a far cry from the woman Ji-hyun remembered. Her hair, once worn in soft waves, was now styled in an elegant updo, accentuating the sharp lines of her jaw and the luminous glow of her skin. As she spoke, a faint smile danced on her lips, but there was a distance in her expression, as though her thoughts remained anchored somewhere far away. Ji-hyun's chest tightened. The years had done nothing to dull the memory of her laughter, the way her eyes used to light up whenever she spoke of her dreams. But now, those same eyes, which turned briefly in his direction, held nothing but cold indifference. Their gazes locked for a fleeting moment. A storm of emotions flashed through Ji-hyun's mind, guilt, longing, and a sharp pang of regret. But Yoon-ji was the first to break the connection, turning away as if he were just another face in the crowd. Ji-hyun clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. How could she act so unaffected, as though the history between them was nothing but an illusion? And yet, wasn't that exactly what he deserved? Ji-hyun-si, I didn't expect to see you here tonight. The voice jolted him from his thoughts. Kang Min-seok, his longtime friend and legal advisor, approached with a sly grin. Dressed in his usual understated attire, Min-seok had an uncanny knack for reading Ji-hyun's mind, a skill that Ji-hyun often found both useful and irritating. She looks good, doesn't she? Min-seok said, his tone bordering on teasing. Ji-hyun's scowl deepened. I don't have time for your games tonight, Min-seok. Min-seok chuckled, his gaze following Ji-hyun's to where Yoon-ji now moved gracefully through the crowd. It's not a game. I just think it's interesting. You seem unsettled. Unsettled. That was putting it mildly. Ji-hyun turned back to the crowd, his heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. The years apart hadn't dulled his feelings for her. If anything, they'd only grown more complex. But what could he possibly say to her now? That he regretted everything? That he'd been a fool to believe in the lies that tore them apart? The weight of the room seemed to close in on him. The music, once a soothing backdrop, now felt grating. The laughter and clinking glasses were too loud, the air too heavy. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to punish him, Yoon-ji's voice rang out, clear and composed. I'd like to thank everyone for supporting my company's latest initiative. This project means the world to me, and I couldn't have done it without the amazing team by my side. Ji-hyun's heart sank further. She wasn't just attending the event, she was one of its key figures. And to those of you who doubted me, she added, her gaze sweeping briefly over the crowd, lingering just a fraction of a second too long on Ji-hyun. I'm grateful. You've reminded me of my strength. The applause that followed felt deafening. Ji-hyun's grip on his emotions slipped further. Her words weren't just a speech, they were a declaration. She was thriving, shining even, despite everything. And he, the man who had once held her heart, had been the one to let her fall. The night stretched on, but Ji-hyun felt every moment acutely. He couldn't approach her, not yet. Instead, He remained on the periphery, watching as she moved with confidence and grace, her laughter ringing out like a melody he no longer had the right to hear. The crisp morning air was still as Seo Ji-hyun stared out the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment. The skyline of Seoul stretched before him, a sea of shimmering glass and concrete bathed in golden sunlight. Yet, his thoughts were far from the bustling city below. Yoon-ji. Her name echoed in his mind like a familiar melody, one he hadn't allowed himself to hum for years. The sharp lines of her face, the resilience in her voice from the previous night, they were vivid reminders of everything he'd tried to bury. Ji-hyun pressed his fingers against the cool glass, his reflection staring back with a mixture of regret and frustration. He had loved her. A sudden knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Kang Min-seok stepped in, carrying a stack of files and a knowing smirk. "You're brooding," he said without preamble, dropping the papers onto Ji-hyun's sleek marble desk. Ji-hyun didn't respond. "I know that look," Min-seok continued, leaning against the edge of the desk. "You've been replaying last night in your head. Am I wrong?" Ji-hyun sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "You're not helping." Min-seok raised an eyebrow. "You didn't exactly make it easy on yourself. What were you expecting? For her to come running back the moment she saw you?" Ji-hyun's jaw tightened. "I wasn't expecting anything." "That's good," Min-seok said, his tone softening. "Because after everything you put her through, you're going to need a miracle to fix this." The memory of their past struck Ji-hyun with full force later that day, as he sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. Han Yoon-ji had been a whirlwind of life when they first met. She wasn't the type to shrink in the face of adversity. Her determination had always been one of the things he admired most about her. With her sparkling eyes and contagious laughter, she had breathed color into his meticulously ordered world. But that was before the accusations, before the betrayal. Ji-hyun closed his eyes, his mind spiraling back to the moment everything fell apart. It had been late one evening. The sky outside his office darkened by storm clouds. Ji-hyun sat at his desk, his tie loosened, and a mountain of documents spread before him. Shin Hye-ri, one of his top employees and a trusted confidant, entered the room with a concerned expression. "Ji-hyun-si, I need to talk to you. It's about Yoon-ji," she said, her voice low and hesitant. Ji-hyun had looked up, surprised. "What about her?" Hye-ri hesitated before sliding a folder onto his desk. Inside were photos and financial reports, each one seemingly damning. Funds had been transferred out of the company's accounts, the trail leading back to Yoon-ji. "I didn't want to believe it either," Hye-ri said, her voice laced with sympathy. "But the evidence is there. I thought you should know before this becomes public." Ji-hyun's heart had plummeted. He had tried to confront Yoon-ji, but she had denied everything. Her eyes, wide with disbelief and hurt, had pleaded with him to trust her. "Ji-hyun, I swear I didn't do this," she had said, her voice trembling. "You have to believe me." But he hadn't. The photos, the reports, everything seemed irrefutable. And though part of him wanted to believe her, the seed of doubt had been planted too deeply. "You don't trust me," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After everything we've been through, you think I'm capable of this?" His silence had been the final blow. The following days were a blur of heartbreak and confusion. Yoon-ji's name had been cleared eventually, but the damage had already been done. She had left, and Ji-hyun had told himself it was for the best. The sharp ring of his office phone snapped Ji-hyun back to the present. "Ji-hyun-si," his secretary's voice came through the intercom. "You have a meeting with Han Yoon-ji in an hour." His breath caught. "What?" "It's about the new acquisition project. Her company is one of the competitors." Ji-hyun gritted his teeth. He should have known their paths would cross again. Yoonji wasn't just thriving. She was directly challenging him. An hour later, Ji-hyun entered the conference room, his expression stoic as ever. Yoonji was already there, seated at the far end of the table. She didn't look up as he took his seat, her focus entirely on the documents before her. The room was filled with other executives, but the tension between Ji-hyun and Yoonji was palpable. Min-seok, seated beside Ji-hyun, raised an eyebrow, but wisely said nothing. When Yoonji finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured. As you can see from the proposal, our approach is not only cost-effective but also sustainable. Ji-hyun barely heard the words. He was too distracted by the way she carried herself, confident, composed, untouchable. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Yoonji's company was a serious contender for the contract. Ji-hyun's team asked questions, but Yoonji answered each one with precision, her arguments sharp and unyielding. Toward the end of the meeting, her gaze finally met his. For a brief moment, Ji-hyun thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Anger, perhaps, or even sadness. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. As the executives filed out of the room, Yoonji lingered, gathering her papers. Ji-hyun hesitated before approaching her. "Yoonji," he began, his voice low. She paused but didn't look up. "Is there something you need, Ji-hyun-si?" Her formal tone stung. "About last night?" She cut him off with a sharp laugh, finally meeting his gaze. "Last night? Is this about the speech? Don't flatter yourself. Not everything is about you." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Ji-hyun standing alone, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. Seo Ji-hyun's office was a temple of modernity, sleek furniture in muted tones, glass walls overlooking Seoul's bustling skyline, and a palpable air of precision. Yet, for all its orderliness, it offered no comfort. Ji-hyun leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He replayed the meeting with Han Eunji, her sharp tone, and the cold dismissal etched into her words. She hadn't just moved on, she'd rebuilt herself entirely. The intercom buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. "Ji-hyun-si, the board is ready for your presentation," his secretary announced. Ji-hyun stood, adjusting his tailored suit. "I'll be right there." The boardroom was already buzzing with conversation when Ji-hyun entered, his presence immediately silencing the chatter. Executives turned their attention to him, their expressions expectant. He strode to the head of the table, his every movement deliberate. "Let's begin," he said, his voice firm and commanding. As the presentation progressed, Ji-hyun outlined the company's strategy for securing the lucrative contract. Charts and graphs illuminated the room as he spoke with practiced confidence. But even as he detailed the figures, his mind wandered to Yoonji's proposal. Her pitch had been impressive, no doubt about it. She'd anticipated every question, countered every argument. She was no longer the inexperienced woman he remembered. Ji-hyun clenched his jaw, redirecting his focus to the task at hand. He couldn't allow his emotions to cloud his judgment. Not now, when so much was at stake. Later that evening, Ji-hyun found himself at a small, upscale bar. The low lighting and ambient jazz music created a cocoon of quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. Min-seok slid onto the stool beside him, ordering a whiskey without asking. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. Ji-hyun didn't respond immediately. He swirled his glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the dim light. "She's changed," he finally said. Min-seok nodded. "And you didn't expect that?" "Not like this," Ji-hyun admitted. "She's unstoppable. I don't know if I can compete with her now." Min-seok chuckled softly. "You're not competing with her, Ji-hyun. At least you shouldn't be. This isn't about business. It's about fixing what you broke." Ji-hyun's grip tightened around the glass. "I don't even know where to start." "Start by being honest. Admit you were wrong, Min Seok said, leaning back, and hope she's willing to listen. The opportunity to face Yoonji came sooner than Ji-hyun anticipated. 2 days later, they were both summoned to a follow-up meeting with the client overseeing the contract. The meeting was set in a sprawling conference hall, its minimalist design and glass walls mirroring the high-stakes nature of the negotiation. Ji-hyun arrived early, taking a moment to compose himself. He stood by the window, watching the city below, when he heard the click of heels against the polished floor. Yoonji had arrived. She wore a crisp white blouse paired with tailored navy trousers, her hair cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. Her entrance was quiet but commanding, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Good morning," she said evenly, her eyes briefly meeting Ji-hyun's before shifting to the client. As the meeting commenced, the tension between Ji-hyun and Yoonji simmered beneath the surface. While their words remained professional, their exchanges carried an undercurrent of unresolved emotions. At one point, Yoonji presented a counterproposal that directly challenged Ji-hyun's strategy. Her arguments were concise, her delivery poised. Ji-hyun responded with equal precision, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his gaze. A mix of admiration and regret. When the meeting concluded, the client commended both sides for their presentations, leaving the decision for another day. The attendees began to disperse, but Ji-hyun lingered, watching as Yoonji gathered her materials. "Yoonji," he said, his voice low. She paused but didn't look up. "What is it now?" Ji-hyun hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wanted to say, you were impressive today." Yoonji finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Is that all?" "No," Ji-hyun admitted, his voice softening. "I also wanted to apologize for everything." Her eyes narrowed. "Everything? You think a single apology can erase what happened?" "No," he said quickly. "I don't expect that. I need you to know I regret how things ended, and I want to make it right." Yoonji's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Make it right?" "Ji-hyun-si, some things can't be fixed." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ji-hyun standing alone, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his chest. Seo Ji-hyun adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket as he stepped into the sleek, modern venue hosting the city's most talked-about collaborative event. The spacious hall was a blend of industrial chic and understated elegance, glass walls framed by steel beams, minimalist decor, and clusters of warm Edison lights hanging low enough to create intimacy among the crowd. The air buzzed with energy. Innovators from tech, fashion, and sustainability industries mingled over curated cocktails and gourmet hors d'oeuvres, their voices a hum of excitement punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Ji-hyun moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone used to being watched, his sharp features impassive but striking. His polished shoes clicked softly against the concrete floor as he scanned the room. He wasn't here to network. Not tonight. And then he saw her. Han Yoonji stood near a curated display of her company's latest collection, a fusion of modern aesthetics and sustainable craftsmanship. Dressed in a deep emerald dress that hugged her figure, she exuded effortless confidence. Her hair, loose and slightly curled, framed her face in a way that softened the sharp determination in her expression. Ji-hyun's gaze lingered, his breath catching as she leaned forward slightly to explain a concept to a small group, her tone animated and sure. He had forgotten how captivating she could be when she spoke about her work. "You're staring again," came a teasing voice behind him. Ji-hyun didn't need to turn to know it was Min Seok. "Don't you have anyone else to bother?" Ji-hyun muttered, taking a sip of his whiskey to disguise his irritation. Min Seok chuckled, leaning casually against a nearby pillar. "Not when you're providing this kind of entertainment. You've been stuck in the same spot for 5 minutes. Are you planning to talk to her, or just admire from afar?" "She doesn't want to talk to me," Ji-hyun admitted, his tone clipped. "True," Min Seok said with a shrug. But maybe you need to stop thinking about what she wants right now and focus on what she needs. And I think she needs to see you're not the same man who hurt her. The opportunity came sooner than Ji-hyun expected. A panel discussion was announced, and Yoon-ji had been selected as one of the speakers. She walked up to the stage with the same quiet grace that Ji-hyun remembered from years ago, but now it was paired with an air of authority that demanded attention. As she spoke about the intersection of sustainability and innovation, Ji-hyun found himself drawn in despite his intentions. Her voice was smooth, her words precise, and her passion undeniable. She was no longer the woman who had stood in his shadow. She was blazing her own path. When the panel ended, Ji-hyun didn't hesitate. As Yoon-ji descended the stage, he stepped forward, his towering frame forcing her to stop. "Yoon-ji," he said, his voice calm but firm. Her eyes flickered with recognition and annoyance. "Ji-hyun-si, are you following me now?" He ignored the bite in her words. "I'd like to talk." "We already talked," she said, brushing past him. "And as I recall, I said some things can't be fixed." He matched her stride, unwilling to let her escape so easily. "I know I hurt you," he began, his tone softening, "but I need you to understand how much I regret." She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. The crowd swirled around them, oblivious to the tension crackling between the two. "You regret it?" she said, her voice low but sharp. "Do you have any idea what I went through because of you? The humiliation? The isolation?" Ji-hyun swallowed hard, his normally steady demeanor faltering under the weight of her words. "I trusted you, Ji-hyun," she continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And when I needed you the most, you turned your back on me." The silence that followed was deafening. Ji-hyun opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he possibly say to erase the pain he had caused? "Excuse me," Yoon-ji said finally, her voice trembling slightly as she stepped around him and disappeared into the crowd. Later that night, Ji-hyun stood outside the venue, the cool breeze doing little to calm the turmoil in his chest. He replayed the confrontation over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. Min Seok found him there, hands shoved into his pockets as he approached. "Rough night." Ji-hyun shot him a withering glare but said nothing. "She's not going to forgive you overnight, you know," Min Seok said, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "You hurt her deeply. It's going to take more than a few words to fix that." Ji-hyun exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chilly air. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know where to start." Min Seok clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Start by showing her you've changed. Actions speak louder than words, Ji-hyun. If you want her to trust you again, you're going to have to prove you deserve it." Ji-hyun nodded, the weight of Min Seok's words settling heavily on his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt truly unsure of himself. But one thing was clear. He couldn't give up. Not yet. The next morning, Seo Ji-hyun sat in his office, staring at a file on his desk. His jaw was tight, and his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. The words on the documents in front of him blurred, their weight pressing down on him like a physical force. The folder had been delivered earlier that day by Kang Min Seok, who now stood across from him, arms crossed and expression grim. "I told you it was bad," Min Seok said quietly. Ji-hyun's silence was answer enough. Inside the folder was the truth, proof that Shin Hee-ri had forged the evidence that had torn him and Yoon-ji apart. Bank statements falsified to look like embezzlement, fake emails, and manipulated photos, all crafted meticulously to frame Yoon-ji as a thief. "Why didn't I see this?" Ji-hyun's voice was low, almost a growl. "Because you didn't want to," Min Seok replied, his tone blunt but not unkind. "Hye-ri played on your insecurities, and you let her. You trusted the wrong person, Ji-hyun. And now you're paying the price? Ji-hyun clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface, not just at Hye-ri, but at himself. He had destroyed the one good thing in his life because of his blind trust in someone else. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice cold. "Hye-ri? Probably in her office, still pretending she's loyal to you," Min-seok said. "But if you're planning to confront her, be smart about it. This isn't just about clearing your conscience. It's about fixing what you broke." The confrontation was swift and brutal. Ji-hyun stormed into Hye-ri's office without knocking, his presence filling the room like a thundercloud. She looked up from her desk, startled, but quickly masked her surprise with a practiced smile. "Ji-hyun-si," she began, her tone smooth. "What brings you—" He threw the file onto her desk, cutting her off. "Explain this." Hye-ri's eyes flicked to the documents, her smile faltering. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Ji-hyun snapped, his voice sharp as a blade. "I trusted you, and you used that trust to destroy someone I cared about. Why?" For a moment, Hye-ri's mask slipped, and something like fear flickered in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by defiance. "Because she wasn't good enough for you," Hye-ri said, her voice rising. "Yoon-ji was weak, naive. She didn't belong in your world, Ji-hyun. I did what I had to do to protect you." Ji-hyun's expression hardened. "Protect me? You didn't protect me, Hye-ri. You destroyed the only person who ever made me feel whole. And for what? Your ambition." Hye-ri opened her mouth to respond, but Ji-hyun held up a hand, silencing her. "You're done here," he said coldly. "I'll have Min-seok handle your resignation. And don't think about fighting this. You'll lose." As he turned to leave, Hye-ri's voice stopped him. "She'll never forgive you, Ji-hyun," she said, her tone venomous. "No matter what you do." Ji-hyun didn't respond. He didn't need to. The next few days were a whirlwind. Ji-hyun worked tirelessly to clear Eun-ji's name, quietly reaching out to journalists and industry insiders to set the record straight. He released a statement admitting his mistakes and commending Eun-ji's success, knowing it was the least he could do to begin making amends. But even as he took these steps, Ji-hyun knew it wouldn't be enough. Words were cheap. He needed to prove through action that he was willing to sacrifice for her. That opportunity came sooner than expected. The contract that both Ji-hyun and Eun-ji were vying for had reached its final stage. The client, impressed with both proposals, announced a joint meeting to discuss the final decision. Ji-hyun sat at the long conference table, his eyes fixed on the door as Eun-ji entered. She wore a tailored black suit, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Her expression was calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes as she took her seat opposite him. As the meeting began, Ji-hyun listened carefully to the client's concerns. They wanted innovation, yes, but also collaboration. Two things Ji-hyun knew Eun-ji's company excelled at. When it was his turn to speak, Ji-hyun stood, buttoning his jacket as he addressed the room. "I'd like to propose something different," he said, his voice steady. "While my company has the resources and expertise to execute this project, I believe Han Eun-ji's company offers a unique perspective that would elevate the final product. Therefore, I'm withdrawing my bid and fully endorsing her proposal." A stunned silence filled the room. Eun-ji's eyes widened, and for a moment, her composure slipped. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ji-hyun turned to her, his gaze steady. "What's right?" Later, outside the conference room, Eun-ji caught up with Ji-hyun, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Ji-hyun interrupted. "I owed you that much, and more." Eun-ji stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and something she couldn't quite name. You think this changes anything? She asked finally. Ji-hyun shook his head. No. But it's a start. As he walked away, Yoonji stood frozen, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of something she thought she'd buried long ago. Hope. Han Eunji sat in her office, her mind a storm of thoughts she couldn't quiet. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, bathing the room in a golden glow, but she barely noticed. Ji-hyun's words echoed in her head. It's a start. Her hands gripped the edge of her polished wooden desk as she replayed the scene from the meeting earlier that day. His unexpected withdrawal from the contract, his endorsement of her company. It didn't make sense. Ji-hyun wasn't the type to sacrifice anything, let alone something this important. There was a knock at the door. Come in, she said, her voice sharper than intended. Yoon Dae-hoon entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. He carried an air of calm confidence, his suit impeccable as always. His warm smile faltered slightly when he saw her tense expression. I saw the news about the contract, he began, placing a folder on her desk. Congratulations. Though I suspect there's more to the story. Yoonji sighed, leaning back in her chair. You'd be right. Dae-hoon pulled up a chair, his dark eyes searching hers. Do you want to talk about it? For a moment, Yoonji considered brushing him off, but Dae-hoon had been a steady presence in her life during her hardest years, and she trusted him more than most. Ji-hyun withdrew, she said finally. Dae-hoon's eyebrows rose. He what? He said it was the right thing to do, Yoonji continued, her voice tinged with disbelief. But why now? After everything that happened, why would he suddenly care? Dae-hoon's jaw tightened. Because he regrets losing you. The bluntness of his words made Yoonji flinch. You're overthinking this, Dae-hoon added, leaning forward. He's trying to worm his way back into your life. Don't let him. Yoonji's eyes narrowed. I'm not. I need to know what he's really after. Later that evening, Ji-hyun stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the crisp night air cooling his heated skin. The city stretched out below him, a sea of lights twinkling like distant stars. He had thought withdrawing from the contract would give him some semblance of peace, but it had only deepened the ache in his chest. Yoonji's face, confused, wary, and still so beautiful, lingered in his mind. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. He turned reluctantly, picking it up to see a message from Min-seok. Min-seok. Are you sure about this? Giving up the contract won't fix things overnight. Ji-hyun's fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed his reply. Ji-hyun. I know, but it's a start. The next day, Yoonji received an invitation she hadn't expected. A gala hosted by Ji-hyun's company. The invitation was sleek and understated, with a handwritten note inside. I'd like to talk. No business, no pretense, just us. Ji-hyun. Yoonji stared at the note for what felt like an eternity. She told herself it was a bad idea to go, that she owed him nothing. And yet, curiosity gnawed at her. What did he have to say that couldn't wait? The gala was a spectacle of luxury, held in an elegant ballroom adorned with cascading floral arrangements and glittering chandeliers. The soft strains of a string quartet filled the air as guests in designer attire mingled. Yoonji entered with her head held high, her black gown accentuating her natural grace. Heads turned as she passed, whispers trailing in her wake. She spotted Ji-hyun almost immediately, standing near the grand staircase. He looked sharp as ever in a tailored suit, but there was a weight to his expression, a quiet vulnerability she hadn't seen before. When their eyes met, he moved toward her, his steps measured but deliberate. You came, he said, his voice low and warm. I'm not here to forgive you, Yoonji replied, her tone cool. You said you wanted to talk, so talk. Ji-hyun hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. She followed him reluctantly, the hum of the crowd fading as they stepped onto a small balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air brushed against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Ji-hyun noticed and shrugged off his jacket, draping it over her shoulders without a word. Yoonji frowned but didn't push it away. "I owe you an explanation," Ji-hyun began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. "About everything. About why I believed Hae-ri, why I didn't fight for you when I should have." Yoonji folded her arms, her gaze piercing. "You had years to explain. Why now?" Ji-hyun exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Because I was a coward. I let my pride, my insecurities, blind me to the truth, and I hurt you in ways I'll never be able to undo." Yoonji's heart tightened, but she kept her expression guarded. "What do you want from me, Ji-hyun?" "Nothing," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need you to know that I regret everything, that I'm trying to be better, even if it's too late for us." The raw sincerity in his voice shook something loose inside her, but she refused to let it show. "I'll admit," she said after a long pause, "I didn't expect you to step aside for the contract. That surprised me." Ji-hyun gave her a small, rueful smile. "You deserve it more than I do." For the first time in years, Yoonji saw a glimpse of the man she had once loved, the one who had been kind and thoughtful, before ambition and fear had consumed him. But she couldn't ignore the scars he had left behind. "It's going to take more than words and gestures, Ji-hyun," she said quietly. "You broke my trust, and I don't know if that's something I can rebuild." Ji-hyun nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I understand, but I'll keep trying, Yoonji, no matter how long it takes." They stood in silence for a moment, the city lights stretching out before them. For Yoonji, the future felt uncertain, but for the first time in years, there was a flicker of something she thought she'd lost, the possibility of healing. The murmur of the crowd in the press conference room was a low hum, punctuated by the occasional click of a camera shutter. Seo Ji-hyun sat at the head of the long table, his jaw tight and shoulders squared. His tailored navy suit fit him impeccably, but there was a tension in his posture that even his impeccable composure couldn't mask. Across from him, reporters gathered like vultures, their pens poised and eyes glinting with curiosity. At his side sat Kang Min-seok, who looked far more relaxed but equally prepared for what was about to unfold. This wasn't just a press conference. This was redemption. Meanwhile, Han Yoonji sat in her office, scrolling through her phone with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. The live feed of Ji-hyun's press conference was plastered across every major news outlet. She had told herself she wouldn't watch it. She had promised herself it didn't matter what he had to say. And yet, her hand trembled slightly as she tapped the screen to unmute the video. The first thing she noticed was Ji-hyun's expression. Calm, yet with a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ji-hyun began, his deep voice steady, but weighted. "I've called this press conference to address a matter of both personal and professional importance." The room went silent, every reporter leaning forward in anticipation. "Years ago, I made a mistake," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "A mistake that cost someone very dear to me their reputation, their career, and their dignity. I let myself be deceived, and in doing so, I failed not only as a leader, but as a human being." Yoonji's breath caught. Ji-hyun went on, detailing the fabricated evidence, Shin Hye-ri's manipulations, and his own blind trust that had led to the public humiliation of Han Yoonji. "The woman I wronged," he said, his voice faltering slightly, "deserved better. She was not only innocent but brilliant, driven, and far more resilient than I could ever be. And while I cannot undo the damage I caused, I am here to set the record straight." He turned to Min-seok, who slid a stack of documents across the table. These are the full findings of an internal investigation conducted by my legal team, Ji-hyun explained. They include proof of the falsified evidence, as well as a formal apology from Shin Hye-ri, who has since been dismissed from her position. The cameras flashed furiously as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Yoonji's heart pounded as she watched. This wasn't the calculated, image-conscious Ji-hyun she had known. This was someone raw, unguarded, willing to expose his flaws to the world. I understand that words and apologies will never be enough to repair the damage I've done, Ji-hyun concluded, his voice softer now. But I hope this serves as a step toward accountability. Not just for myself, but for the kind of leader I want to be. Back in the room, the first question came swiftly. Ji-hyun-si, is this public apology motivated by guilt, or is it an attempt to salvage your company's reputation? Ji-hyun's gaze was steady as he replied, "This isn't about the company. It's about the person I failed. If this affects my reputation, so be it. My priority is ensuring that the truth is known, and that Han Yoonji receives the recognition she has always deserved." When the press conference ended, Ji-hyun stepped off the stage feeling like he had just run a marathon. The weight of his actions, and their consequences, still loomed over him, but there was a faint glimmer of relief. Min Seok caught up with him as they exited the building. "Well," he said, clapping a hand on Ji-hyun's shoulder. "That was gutsy. Let's hope it wasn't for nothing." Ji-hyun nodded, but he knew the real test would come next. Would Yoonji even care? Hours later, Yoonji sat in her living room, the press conference replaying in her mind. She had seen Ji-hyun handle public relations disasters before, but this was different. This wasn't a performance. This was personal. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late. When she opened the door, Ji-hyun stood there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I wanted to make sure you saw the press conference," he said simply. Yoonji crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I saw it. Congratulations on your big apology." Ji-hyun winced at her sarcasm, but didn't back down. "It wasn't about me, Yoonji. It was about you." Her eyes narrowed. "Do you think that changes anything? Do you think I'll forgive you just because you went on TV and told the world you were wrong?" "No," Ji-hyun said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know the truth." For a long moment, they stared at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Yoonji stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. They sat across from each other in her modest but cozy living room, the hum of the city outside a faint backdrop to their conversation. "Why now, Ji-hyun?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Why do this after all these years?" Ji-hyun leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. I should have done it sooner, but I was too afraid. Afraid of facing you. Afraid of admitting how badly I failed." Yoonji studied him carefully. There was something different about him now. Something that made her want to believe him, even as her heart resisted. "You've changed," she said finally, her tone laced with disbelief. Ji-hyun met her gaze. "I'm trying to." For the first time, Yoonji allowed herself to consider the possibility that the man sitting before her wasn't the same one who had betrayed her all those years ago. The city lay under a blanket of stars, the faint hum of traffic rising and falling in the distance. On the balcony of Han Yoonji's apartment, a light breeze rustled the potted plants lining the railings. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of the nearby Han River. Yoonji leaned against the railing, her arms wrapped around herself, though the chill wasn't the reason for her unease. Behind her, Seo Ji-hyun sat in silence on the outdoor love seat. His usually sharp gaze softened as he watched her. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it brimmed with unspoken tension. Finally, Yoonji broke the silence. "I don't know what to think anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to face him, her expression conflicted. "You've done all this, apologized, sacrificed the contract, but none of it erases what happened." Ji-hyun nodded, his hands clasped in front of him. "I know, and I'm not asking you to forget. I'm not even asking you to forgive me." Yoonji frowned, stepping closer. "Then what are you asking for?" Ji-hyun looked up at her, the raw vulnerability in his eyes catching her off guard. "A chance to prove that I can be better, that I'm not the same man who let you down." Yoonji turned away, gripping the railing tightly. Her thoughts raced, colliding in a storm of emotions. She had spent years rebuilding herself after the humiliation Ji-hyun had caused. She had become stronger, more independent, but the scars he left behind still ached. Yet, his actions in the past weeks spoke of a sincerity she hadn't expected. The Ji-hyun she once knew had been proud, unyielding, and unwilling to admit his faults. But now, he was different. Humble, regretful, and perhaps most importantly, patient. "You hurt me more than anyone ever has," she said finally, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain steady. "You destroyed everything I had worked for, and you didn't even give me a chance to explain." Ji-hyun rose from his seat, his tall frame casting a shadow over her in the dim light. "I know," he said softly, "and I've hated myself for it every day since. I don't expect you to trust me again, but I needed to face you and take responsibility." Yoonji turned to face him, her heart hammering in her chest. She searched his face for any sign of deceit, but all she found was a man who looked as though he had been carrying the weight of his guilt for far too long. "You've changed," she said, almost to herself. Ji-hyun's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "I had to. Losing you made me realize how much I needed to." The conversation shifted as they moved back inside. Yoonji poured them each a cup of tea, the faint aroma of jasmine filling the room. They sat across from each other at the small dining table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting warm shadows. "What happens now?" Yoonji asked, her hands cradling the warm ceramic cup. Ji-hyun hesitated, the weight of her question hanging heavily in the air. "That depends on you," he said finally. "I'm not here to pressure you or demand anything. I just want to be part of your life again, even if it's only as a friend." Yoonji arched an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism creeping into her expression. "A friend?" Ji-hyun chuckled softly, his tone tinged with self-deprecation. "I know how that sounds, but if that's all you're willing to offer, I'll take it. Because even having a small piece of your life is better than being completely shut out." For the first time that night, Yoonji allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness, but it was a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Later, after Ji-hyun had left, Yoonji stood by the window, watching the distant lights of the city. She thought about his words, his actions, and the man he seemed to have become. Could she truly allow herself to believe in him again? Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Yoon Dae-hoon. "Dae-hoon, did Ji-hyun come to see you? I heard about the press conference. Be careful, Yoonji. He knows how to manipulate people when he wants something." Yoonji frowned, the warning sinking into her chest like a stone. Dae-hoon had been her rock through the darkest times, and she trusted his instincts. But this time she wasn't so sure. Ji-hyun's actions didn't feel like manipulation. They felt genuine. The doubt lingered, but so did the flicker of hope that she had seen in Ji-hyun's eyes. Across town, Ji-hyun returned to his empty penthouse, his footsteps echoing through the spacious yet sterile space. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the faint light from the city below. He had done everything he could to make amends, but the outcome was no longer in his hands. For the first time in years, Ji-hyun felt vulnerable, not as a CEO, but as a man who had laid his heart bare. As he sat in silence, his thoughts drifted to Yoonji's smile. It had been small, fleeting, but it was a start. And for Ji-hyun, that was enough. The following week was a whirlwind for Han Eun-ji. The success of her company's new contract brought waves of attention, with interviews, partnership proposals, and event invitations flooding in. Yet, amidst the chaos of her professional triumph, her thoughts kept circling back to Seo Ji-hyun. She sat in her office one evening, the city lights twinkling beyond the glass wall. Papers were strewn across her desk, but her focus remained elsewhere. Ji-hyun's press conference replayed in her mind. The way his voice trembled slightly as he admitted his failures. The way he had faced the cameras with unflinching honesty. Yoonji exhaled sharply and leaned back in her chair. "What am I doing?" she muttered to herself. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Yoon Dae-hoon. "Dinner tonight?" his text read. Yoonji hesitated before typing back. "Sure. 7 p.m. The restaurant was a cozy, upscale spot tucked away in one of Seoul's quieter neighborhoods. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses created a relaxing ambiance. Dae-hoon greeted Yoonji with his usual warm smile, pulling out her chair for her as they settled in. "You've been busy," he said as the waiter poured their wine. "I barely managed to steal you away for this dinner." Yoonji smiled faintly. "It's been hectic, but in a good way." Dae-hoon nodded, studying her carefully. "And Ji-hyun? Has he been causing you trouble?" The question made her pause. She placed her glass down, swirling the liquid absent-mindedly. "No," she admitted. "He's been different." Dae-hoon's expression tightened slightly, but he kept his tone neutral. "Different how?" "He's changed," Yoonji said, almost to herself. "He admitted his mistakes publicly. He stepped back when he didn't have to. It's not the Ji-hyun I remember." Dae-hoon leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Yoonji, people don't change overnight, especially not someone like Ji-hyun. Be careful, okay? I just don't want you to get hurt again." Her chest tightened at his words. Dae-hoon's concern was genuine, but it only added to the confusion swirling in her heart. Across town, Ji-hyun stood in his penthouse, staring at the stack of documents on his desk. They were proposals, ways to support Yoonji's company behind the scenes without her knowing. He didn't want her gratitude or recognition. He just wanted to help. Kang Min-seok walked in, unannounced as usual, holding 2 coffee cups. "Still brooding?" Min-seok asked, setting a cup in front of Ji-hyun. Ji-hyun shot him a look but didn't respond. Min-seok sighed, sitting across from him. "You're overthinking again. Just talk to her. You've done enough grand gestures. It's time to be real with her." Ji-hyun frowned. "What if it's too late? What if I've already lost her?" "Then at least you'll know you tried," Min-seok said simply. That night, Ji-hyun made a decision. He wasn't going to let fear hold him back any longer. 2 days later, Yoonji arrived at her office to find a small package waiting on her desk. The wrapping was simple, with a handwritten note attached. "I know I've taken enough of your time, but there's one more thing I need to say. Meet me at the bridge at 8 p.m. Ji-hyun." Yoonji stared at the note for a long moment, her heart pounding. She considered ignoring it, letting him wait in vain. But something, curiosity perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope, pushed her to pick up the phone and clear her evening schedule. The Han River glistened under the moonlight, the gentle ripple of the water reflecting the city's lights. The air was crisp but not uncomfortably so, carrying the faint scent of rain. Ji-hyun stood on the bridge, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat as he waited. He had chosen this spot deliberately. It was where he and Yoonji had shared their first date years ago, sitting on the railing and talking about their dreams until dawn. He heard the soft click of heels against the pavement and turned. Yoonji approached slowly, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of the bridge's lights. She wore a simple trench coat, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "You wanted to talk," she said, stopping a few feet away from him. Ji-hyun nodded, his heart racing. "Thank you for coming." She crossed her arms, waiting. Ji-hyun took a deep breath. "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry, Yoonji, for everything. For not trusting you, for hurting you, for ruining what we had." Yoonji's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued, "but I couldn't let this end without you knowing how much I regret losing you. You're the strongest, most incredible person I've ever known, and I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I hadn't let you go." The vulnerability in his voice sent a shiver through Yoonji. She had spent so long resenting him, convincing herself that she had moved on. But now, standing here, she couldn't deny that part of her still cared. "You broke my heart, Ji-hyun," she said quietly. "And I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Ji-hyun's chest tightened, but he nodded. "I understand, and I'll accept whatever you decide." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft lapping of the river below. Finally, Yoonji stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. "If we try again, it has to be different. No secrets, no lies. And it won't be easy." Ji-hyun's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering in his expression. "I'll do whatever it takes, I promise." For the first time in years, Yoonji let herself smile, not fully, but enough to show that the walls around her heart were beginning to crack. "We'll see," she said softly. They stood together on the bridge, the past still weighing heavily between them, but the faint promise of a future beginning to take shape. The soft cry of a baby filled the hospital room, blending with the first rays of morning sunlight filtering through the blinds. Han Eun-ji cradled the tiny bundle in her arms, her face glowing with a mix of exhaustion and joy. The little boy squirmed slightly, his small fingers curling against the soft blanket wrapped around him. Yoonji's heart swelled as she kissed the baby's forehead. "You're perfect," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. A quiet knock at the door drew her attention. Seo Ji-hyun stood hesitantly in the doorway, his usual confident demeanor softened. He held a small bouquet of white lilies. The same flowers Yoonji had once mentioned were her favorite. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yoonji nodded, her gaze wary but not unkind. Ji-hyun stepped inside, his footsteps almost silent on the polished floor. He set the flowers on the bedside table, his eyes fixed on the baby. The vulnerability in his expression was unmistakable, and Yoonji couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in his hands as he clasped them together. "He's beautiful," Ji-hyun said softly, his voice filled with awe. Yoonji glanced down at her son, her protective instincts warring with the faint tug of hope she had been feeling for weeks. "He's my everything now," she said simply. Ji-hyun's throat tightened, but he nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." There was a long pause before Yoonji spoke again. "You can hold him, if you want." Ji-hyun's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might refuse. But when Yoonji carefully handed the baby to him, he cradled the tiny boy with surprising gentleness. The weight of the child in his arms sent a wave of emotion crashing over him, and for the first time in years, Ji-hyun felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "I'll do everything I can to be worthy of him," Ji-hyun said, his voice trembling. "And of you." The following months passed in a blur of adjustments and cautious steps forward. Ji-hyun kept his word, showing up not with grand gestures, but with quiet consistency. He supported Yoonji in every way he could, from late-night feedings to helping her balance work and motherhood. At first, Yoonji had been skeptical, waiting for the cracks in Ji-hyun's resolve to show. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to see the depth of his commitment. He wasn't just trying to make amends. He was becoming someone new. One evening, as the baby slept peacefully in his crib, Yoonji and Ji-hyun sat together on the couch in her living room. The soft glow of a single lamp bathed the room in warmth, and the faint hum of the city outside added to the intimate stillness. "You've changed," Yoonji said quietly, breaking the silence. Ji-hyun looked at her, his eyes filled with earnestness. "I had to. Losing you showed me who I didn't want to be." Yoonji studied him for a long moment, her heart conflicted. She had spent so long guarding herself against the pain he had caused. But now, the walls she had built felt more like barriers to the possibility of happiness. "I'm still scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. Ji-hyun reached out hesitantly, his hand hovering over hers, before finally resting gently against it. "So am I. But I'm not going anywhere, Yoonji. Not this time." Months later, they stood on a hill overlooking the Han River, the same spot where they had shared so many moments in the past. The spring blossoms framed the scene in soft shades of pink and white, the gentle breeze carrying the sweet scent of renewal. Yoonji held their son in her arms, his laughter ringing out as Ji-hyun playfully brushed a petal off his tiny hand. For the first time in years, Yoonji felt a sense of peace settle over her. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared. It never truly would. But it had softened, becoming a reminder of how far she had come. Ji-hyun stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But together, they were building something stronger, something real. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in hues of gold and lavender, Ji-hyun turned to Yoonji, his expression both tender and resolute. "I know I don't deserve another chance," he said softly. "But I'll spend the rest of my life earning your trust, if you'll let me." Yoonji looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You've already started." For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to smile. A true, unguarded smile. And as they stood there, the three of them framed by the beauty of the moment, Yoonji realized that perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to let the past go and embrace the future they were building together.